Hello everyone. So in our last video, we had been looking at some of the more advanced things we can do with CSS to position our content and select specific elements. In this video, we're going to take that even further and drill in on some of the different positioning systems that we have available to us in web design. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the normal flow rules, how blocks and inline elements are displayed, and then we're going to look at specific tricks we can use to break those rules. First, we will look at other display types besides our normal flow layout, and then we will look at the position attribute and all of the things that it lets us do. So we're going to start once again with a nice little basic website here. Got our HTML, got our head, got our body. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. Believe it or not, all of those different tags that we've learned, really, with a few exceptions, boil down to just two basic types of elements that we've got in HTML. There are div elements, which are sometimes called block elements, and these elements receive full width of the page and get some default spacing above and below. When you create a div or any block element like a paragraph, a section, an article, all of these different tags will automatically grow to fill your entire page and then give you just a little bit of room above and below. So like we said, paragraphs are the exact same element to the browser engine. The browser just views this thing as a block, so it places some space above and below. Same thing with section, and a few blocks do get special default styling, like headings. If you use an H1, H2, H3, you're still stretching across, but now it'll be bigger, it'll be bold. But all of them are treated the same way when the browser is laying out the page. So that is our first type of element, block elements. Our second type of element are span elements. So if I've got some paragraph and I'm writing something somewhere in the paragraph and I just want to change the value of that text without breaking the flow, that's going to be a span element. Span elements only modify text without reflowing the layout of the entire page. So we've seen a lot of examples of this. We've seen tags like the EM tag for emphasis, or an A tag for a link, or a B tag for bold. That's an old deprecated tag. Any tag that doesn't create a brand new block and just styles this content is an inline element. So these are sometimes called inline elements, and they're just going to take up just that little bit of room. So if we cut over to our browser page, we can see that each one of those block elements we created becomes its own thing, but the EM for emphasis here just tilts just that little part of our paragraph without creating a whole new paragraph. The most basic form of formatting your web pages is just picking out, well, which things should be blocks, which things should be inline. But that doesn't quite go far enough. First thing we can do is we can choose to make things that are usually one the other. I could say in my styles here, well, an emphasis, actually display this as a block. And if I make that change, when I refresh my page, suddenly the EM for emphasis becomes a block. It takes up its own space. It stretches all the way across. If I inspect this, we can see the width has suddenly become the full width of my web page. that's powerful on its own. It does allow us to pick and choose how we want things to be styled, but really the only time that is especially helpful is if you're trying to use attributes that only apply to one or the other, or rather style declarations. Some style declarations that we've talked about, like margin, really only make sense in the context of a block. If something is text that's in the middle of a paragraph, that text doesn't really have a width besides whatever width the words take up, and you can't shrink or grow it. You can't really put balanced space on either side of it because it's meant to be in the middle of a paragraph. So that is our first trick we can do for our web pages, is changing this display to block or inline to say, I want it to behave like the prototypical div or like the prototypical span. That allows us to say, oh, well, I'm just going to change this little bit here. Maybe make the color of just these words red. You can make any tag behave like either of those, but if you want something more exotic, you want a layout for your web page that isn't just full width blocks with some little interspersed styling inside of them, that's when you're going to need to start using some of these more advanced CSS rules. So the first one I'm going to show you is another display rule that we've got right alongside inline and block. For a long time, inline and block is all you got in HTML, and there was one special tag called table that allowed you to make 2D grids, having some columns, having some rows. Table was really a pain to work with, so a while back, CSS decided, hey, this should actually be a new way that we can style blocks. So now, whenever we've got a block of content, let's say I've got a bunch of paragraphs that I want to show up kind of in a grid, what I can do is I can take some parent element for them, say this is the grid parent, and stick all of my elements that I want to show up in this grid as children of that grid. And then if I tell this grid parent over here that you're not going to display as a block, you're not going to display as inline, instead, you're going to display as a grid, then what I am doing is I am taking these things out of the normal flow. The parent here will still be as a block element, but all of its children are going to follow a completely different set of rules for styling these things. So I say that, but right now, if I cut over to the browser, it still looks pretty much the same. Maybe there's a tiny bit more spacing here, but these things still seem to take up the same amount of space. The reason why is because when we use grid, we need to add one extra little bit of information. And that is, over in our style sheet, we need to specify what the dimensions are of our grid. So I've got those little paragraphs. I might choose to say, hey, my grid has some number of columns, and I can use this grid template columns style declaration here to say, well, there's a 200 pixel column, and then a 180 pixel column, and then a 300 pixel column. And now I'm saying, well, I don't just want the text to appear block after block after block. I want you to divide up these blocks into different boxes that are each of these widths. So now, if I go and I refresh my browser, suddenly, these things don't just appear one after the next. Each of my paragraphs that's in my grid takes up that amount of space in that column. And when I run out of columns, it jumps down to the next row and starts taking up that same pattern of columns again. This pair of declarations here for declaring your columns and then making your entire element a grid allows you to lay things out a little bit more freely than you could with just blocks. You can describe exactly how much space each thing should take up without needing to do it using margins very, very precisely. So this was powerful, and this was a great addition to CSS. Grids, it turns out, can go even further. It's still a little bit nasty working with the layout and just saying, okay, well, the only thing I've got access to is the column here. So there are a couple other tricks we can do when we're using a grid. First, there's a special unit of measure for template columns and template rows. You can also set the maximum height of each of these rows. But that special unit of measure is an FR. And what an FR communicates is a proportional amount of space. It's almost like a drink order where you've got one part this column, one part that column, one part that column. You're defining a ratio for your entire columns. So if I say 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, I'm saying all three of my columns should take up the same amount of space. And that will divide it equally into three parts. So, if my width for the entire grid was 300 pixels, then that would mean each paragraph should be 100. If I up it to 600, then each paragraph takes up a width of 200. So that's the first thing we can do to our grids, is choose proportionally how much space they take up. We can also create a gap. I could say there is a column gap of, let's say, 3 EMs, and that's going to create some space between each row. If I go flip back over to the browser, now my entire grid all the way across is 600 pixels. Between each column, there is a 3-letter little gap. There's enough space for 3 letters in there. And then all the remaining space is divided equally between my 3 paragraphs. So already this lets us be a little bit more stylistic in how we're setting up our grid. We can make it look nice. The other thing we can do with these grids that are specified numerically is we can also say exactly what cell we want something to appear in. If I make a paragraph and I say this paragraph should appear in the bottom right corner, then I can do that by applying a style to it, either here just for convenience sake, or more properly back over in my style CSS. I can say, well, this thing is in grid column 3 because I've got 3 columns in my grid. It's in grid row also 3. And if I do that, then when this thing is rendered in the browser, it skips this normal flow of cell, cell, cell. I'm out of columns, so cell, cell, cell. And it says, okay, well, you know what? No matter what the rest of this grid looks like, go down 3 rows, down 3 rows, and then go over 3 columns. This is where that particular paragraph should appear. So this allows us to kind of skip the normal ordering and put things in the places where we want them to appear. That can be very helpful if you're doing something like making a footer and the footer's at the bottom, or you're doing something like cutting in images or inserts and you want them to appear in particular positions on your page, and then let the rest of the content kind of flow in and fill in the gaps. The other thing we can do with numeric grids is take one of our grid items and say this item should spread across multiple columns or multiple rows. I can do this by specifying, once again, my grid column and my grid row. So like, say I want this thing on row 5. Maybe I want the grid column to be 1 up to 4. So this is going to spread all the way across the bottom of my grid. if I refresh this now, this paragraph on the bottom is still in my grid. But if I click on my grid view here, for my entire grid, we can see this bottom paragraph here spans all 3 of my columns. Each other thing is in just one little cell, and there's this gap that is in between each cell, but then at the bottom, this guy goes right across the line, right into the next cell. If I added even more text, it would even scroll to this 3rd box here. And that is because I have specified both a start point and end point for my grid column. You can do this to create multi-spanning rows, which is great for things like we said, footers or sidebars, things where you've got something that doesn't follow the normal structure of the rest of your page. So that is the grid display rule. And this is already really, really powerful. There is a little bit more you can do with grids to make them more convenient. You can also specify things verbally by setting up grid template areas and make a verbal description. MDN has a really great tutorial on that if you want to look at it. But what I want to talk about next is another display rule, something that we can't do with grids. So sometimes when we are dealing with our elements and we've got all of this content here, maybe I care that it is aligned in one direction, but I don't actually care that it's aligned in the other. We had said it's kind of nice when you create this grid, I can just create a bunch of paragraphs and they'll slot in cell by cell. But if you're doing something like running a social media site, you're doing something like creating a form, some form controls might be larger than others. Some social media posts are entire articles. Some are just someone writing what they had for lunch and it's one little sentence. So these are going to be very different sizes, and I just want them nicely aligned in a feed. I don't necessarily care that they're all exactly the same in both dimensions. In cases like that, we can use a flex box to style this content. So if I do the same thing I did before, create a flex parent for my content, I can go and create a bunch of cells and say that inside a flex grid, each element will take up just the space it requires. It's not going to align things in both directions. A flex grid is almost like a one-dimensional grid. I specify whether I care about rows or columns, and then each element is only told how much space in that timeline it takes up. It's not going to require me to lay out both dimensions with some template like we did with a grid. This means our columns or rows may not always match, but the flex box will make sure everything does realign before the next row or column starts. So just like last time, I've got all of these paragraphs in here. If I refresh right now, initially right now, actually, I haven't set that it's a flex box yet. So let's real quick, flex parent, display flex. Now I have said, okay, this thing should behave like flex. And when I cut over to my browser, this thing sort of starts looking like it's behaving like a grid here. Each thing going across takes up some space. But notice I did not have to specify template columns the way that I needed to with my grid before I started seeing any effect. With a flexbox, we actually handle this slightly differently. With a flexbox, we choose which direction we are specifying our dimensions on, which is what is called the flex flow, I can either set flex flow to column or flex flow to row. And then you can also say whether or not this thing wraps. So what we've got right now, that kind of default behavior, is along a row. I'm creating one really long row of content. And now I'm going to say this row of content does wrap. And let's, just so that we can see it wrap, I'm going to create a width for my whole flex box. If I say the entire thing is only 800 pixels across, then when I cut over right now, each one of these elements is going to take up 800 pixels across. When I inspect this, each one of these things takes up how much space it requires, and none of them fit on the same row. If I up this dimension a little bit, say, oh, maybe I can fit 1,000 on each, then now suddenly there are two items here. Just like last time, I've got that problem of not having a gap, but my first paragraph and my second paragraph now fit on this same line without taking up any extra space. So it can say, okay, well, these two fit on a line. The next one doesn't fit here, so I'm going to jump down and then keep going. And you can see, unlike a grid, if I click on this flex, all of the columns don't line up. This paragraph goes up to here. The next paragraph goes up to here. The next paragraph goes all the way up to here. There's no alignment on that vertical dimension. There is only making sure, well, when I get to the end of the row, the whole next row starts together again. So that is a flex box. Just like with grids, there are a couple extra special things we can do to them. The main one I want to point out to you is if I know how much space I want a particular item to take up, I can say, okay, well, you know what? This first paragraph here, the space on the flex dimension, it's only going to take up 200 pixels, let's say. If I do that, then now this thing is constrained and it will start growing down instead of out. And if I do this for each one, say I have a 200 pixel one, a 210 pixel one, I've got after that a flex 300 pixel one, then when I go back over to my browser, we can start to really see the behavior of that flex. Now suddenly, if this whole thing is 800 across, 300 plus 200 gets us to 500, plus 200 gets us to 700. That's within that 800 limit, so all three of these fit on that first row. Because they're different sizes and their sentences are different lengths, they don't take up the same amount of vertical space. This one takes up an extra line, but the next paragraph doesn't start until we've used up all of the same amount of space all the way across. And then it will start this next row here, go all the way across. If I switched this flex parent back to a column wrap, then now that flex dimension that we described is no longer talking about how wide each thing would be. And so the width goes all the way across. Instead, now it's talking about how high each thing should be. So it's taking up room on whichever dimension we specify, row or column. So flex is a little bit of a weird width property in that sometimes it's the width, sometimes it's the height. But what this is really good for is when we create that type of infinite scroll or tile design where you've got all these tiles and they don't fit perfectly together, but you want to make sure they're at least sort of lined up. So that is our display rules. We've now seen block and inline, which are our basic rules that we've been using. And now we also have grids and flex boxes in our toolbox as other ways that we can easily lay out a page. Sometimes we have to go even one step further than that. When we need to do that, that's when we need to break out the positioning CSS attribute. So unlike display, positioning is an ad hoc little change that we make to one element that completely draws it out of the normal flow of a document. So display changes the rules of flow, but positioning is going to say, you know what, whatever system we're in, we're breaking the rules. This thing is not going to be where it's supposed to be. We're going to look at specifically 4 ways that this positioning can be used, and that is with relative positioning, fixed positioning, sticky positioning, or absolute positioning. So these 4 all work mostly the same, but they all use a different coordinate system to describe the changes that they're making. So our first example here, let's say we've got something and we just want to nudge it a little bit in a certain direction without modifying anything around it. So if I've got a case like that, I can actually use positioning to say, how far should I nudge it from the top, from the left, from the right, or from the bottom? And so to do that, I can, let's say, create myself a little box here. And in my little box, I'm going to make a bunch of little colored squares. I will have these colored squares. I'm just going to inline style them here, kind of break our rules. Each one is going to take up 100 pixels across, 100 pixels down. It'll be a square. And if I refresh this right now without any relative changes, and without any text in here, then when I render this page, these boxes are going to show up right like this. Each one shows up one after the next, exactly following our normal flow rules. If I come back over to the code and I say, well, this block, I'm going to position it relative to where it's supposed to be. Specifically, I am going to move it left 40 pixels, top 20 pixels. What I'm saying is, come in from the top and just give it a tap, 20 pixels. Come in from the left and just give it a tap, 20 pixels. And if I do that now, when I refresh the page, suddenly these things are no longer perfectly lined up. What position relative says is, okay, well, move this thing in that direction. So it's kind of the opposite of the numbers you put. I had said the top and the left, and so as a result, it moved down into the right. Relative positioning allows us to just adjust things without moving anything else around it. So just to make it clear what this effect is, let's compare this to if we tried to do the same thing with margin. If I took margin left and margin top, same exact boxes, 100 across, 100 down, same exact size of our container here. When I do this with margin, what happens is instead of adjusting just that one box, because I'm pushing it to the right, everything after it gets pushed to the right, the green box is actually taking up more space if I use margin. If I inspect this, in our relative example, notice the green box still only takes up the exact same amount of document that it did before. It's just like the whole thing was cut with scissors and pasted somewhere else. With margin, now this thing actually has reserved space. It's like it's sitting at the movie theater and it's put belongings and coats on all of these other chairs. It's taken up this other space to say no one else is allowed to use this. So that is really what positioning is good for when we've got situations like we want two things to overlap, but we don't want all of this dead space around them. That is when you're going to reach for a position rule, and relative is most often the one that you're going to reach for. So now, sometimes we want something even more specialized than that. Sometimes I don't want things to be in a position based on where they are on the page normally, but instead I know exactly where it's going to be. These next two rules are great for that. So the first one is a fixed position. When I say something is in a fixed position, what I am doing is I am saying exactly where it should be in my browser window. So in our code here, let's say I've got a div and this div has a go back to the top of page. I've got some kind of jump to some tag up here. We've got a grid parent. If you have an ID, you can actually make a link to an ID to jump. That's how something like Wikipedia takes you around from its table of contents. Here I am saying there's a link. Go back to that grid example because that was at the top of our page. By default, this is just going to show up somewhere on my page, but I can scroll past it and then I don't see that link anymore. If I always want this to be in the bottom corner, so as I scroll up and down, it's always visible there, I can do that by setting a style on this. Say, well, its position is fixed from the bottom of my browser window. I want it to be up 20 pixels. From the right of my browser window, I want it to be from the right 20 pixels. And if I do that, then when I refresh my browser, notice that link is right here, 20 up from the bottom, 20 left from the right edge. And as I scroll up and down, that link stays glued right to that corner of the screen. So this is actually one of the biggest uses of fixed elements, is providing site navigation. If you have something like a sidebar that has all the links on the left of your page, and that sidebar stays even as you're scrolling an article, one way you can achieve that is by making the sidebar fixed so that the rest of the page sort of flows around it. It ignores that it even exists. Could also do this with a grid layout and make your center main article content have a overflow scroll so that it overflows and creates a little internal scroll box. But this is a very, very popular way to create fixed elements with the fixed position attribute or style rule. So notice we're using the same terms here. With our position relative, we used top and left. Now with position fixed, we're again using bottom and right, just like top and left. But the meaning has changed substantially. Just like last time, it kind of nudges us in the opposite of the direction we put. But now, instead of saying, well, relative, the starting point, the 0, 0 of my position is where you were before, now the 0, 0 is the boundaries of my screen. So that is position fixed. And position absolute is sort of like a halfway between position relative and position fixed. So when I've got a element and I want it to be positioned not to the whole window, but instead to be positioned based on where its parent is, I can use position absolute to say use the boundaries of just your parent element that is positioned to figure out where you're supposed to go. So that's a mouthful, a kind of tricky thing to visualize. So I'm going to have an example, and we're going to modify this, build this up so we can see exactly what's happening. Okay, so now to show you the effect of absolute positioning, I'm going to start by just creating another little box for us. If we go and look at our web page, we're going to apply positioning rules to this thing and see what effect it has. So initially, our box is right here in its normal position on the page. First thing I'm going to do is say, well, it is positioned absolutely. And just like with our display rules and our other position rules, if I just apply position, that doesn't do anything on its own. Next, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to position this right 0 pixels. When I say right 0 pixels, you can see, much like with fixed, it jumps over to the right side of this page. But the difference is fixed moves with your browser. Absolute says, well, nope, just it is this far from this edge relative to where it should be. But it still stays in the document in the sense that it remembers what values it had before. What is different about absolute is if I then put this inside of another element, say I've got a div here that has a width of 600 pixels. We'll say it has margin auto so that it is nice and centered. And we'll give it a nice border that is a 2 pixel solid black border so that we can actually see it. Then initially, when I create my element, I come back over here and this thing shows up where it should be. I apply the same rule as before. Say, oh, well, you know, this is position absolute. And then you can see as soon as I made it position absolute, its parent ceased to have anything in it. It's treating this div now like it is empty. So there's just that 2 pixel line to start it, another 2 pixel line to finish it. Looks like one solid black line with nothing in it. Now, if I say, oh, well, it's right 0, it's going to ignore its parent. But if I say, well, the parent is also position relative, even if I don't make any changes to it, this square just moved back in a little bit. So if the width of this box was a little bit shorter, actually 600 pixels, there was a missing colon there, then now we can see if the parent box is relative, the red box, even though I'm saying absolute right 0, it's going to be absolutely 0 from the right of its parent here, not from the right edge of the page. So this is the thing that people mess up most about moving things around in CSS. And a lot of the reputation CSS has comes from people not knowing exactly what absolute and relative positioning do. Relative, remember we said, is for nudging things in a direction. Absolute moves you from the borders of your most closest relative who is positioned. So in this case, our direct ancestor tag, our div that is holding our box, is positioned. So we move relative to the borders of that box. But if we take off that relative positioning, now suddenly we're moving relative to the borders of the entire page, because the entire page is as far as we get up before anything has any positioning information. So that is absolute positioning. The last kind of positioning that we've got is sticky positioning. Sticky positioning is just positioning that is relative until you scroll past it, and then it stays on the page. Just like all of our others, it will also use position. It will also use top, bottom, left, and right. It is really rarely used. About the only time I've seen it used effectively is creating different subheadings as you're scrolling past. Maybe something like a header bar that you want to stay stuck to the page, so that as you scroll down, maybe your navigation is along the top. It's one of those more exotic, sometimes flavors, not something that you should be grabbing for every single element you create. Relative and absolute positioning, you probably will use a lot, so it is worth practicing them. The one last thing I do want to talk about in this video is how we can kind of apply transformations after the fact with one of these positioning rules. So all of our positioning rules follow the same basic format here. Position and then our coordinates. There is one more property I can put, which actually I'm going to show you right in the browser. Say we've got our little element here and it fits nicely inside of its box. And I want to say, well, you know what, this box here, this little red box, I actually want to position it and then kind of give it a skew. There is another property related to position called transform. When I transform something, I then provide some function I want to apply to it, some characteristic that I am using to change how this thing shows up. As an example, I can say I'm going to transform it by skewing it. And if I skew it by 20 degrees, if you know what that word skew means, we're kind of tilting it over to the side like a parallelogram at this point. So all of these use their own extra little coordinates. In this case, I am skewing it degrees, like around a circle. So we end up with that offset. The lines that were up and down are now just 20 degrees tilted to the right. I can even apply two different dimensions here. I'll say, well, 20 degrees, 0 degrees is the same skew. But if I say 20 degrees, 20 degrees, now I am saying, okay, we'll rotate on one axis, also rotate on the other axis, and that ends up with the net effect of rotating the entire square, so that it is now a diamond. It is diagonal in this box. Still positioned to be relative to the edge, but now also rotated. There is a lot of different stuff you can do with the transform attribute. You can skew things, you can grow them, you can shrink them. It is a very, very powerful property, so it is definitely worth looking at. But this has hopefully given you a nice overview of some of the different ways we can position content on your website. In future videos, we're going to talk about how we actually use this effectively, but this has given you the tools to see, in addition to blocks of text that take up the full width and spans that just take up some content, how we can align things into a grid, into a infinite timeline that stretches in one direction with flex, or just adjust them relatively, absolutely, with fixed positioning and applying some transformations after the fact. So hopefully this inspires you to start creating some really eye-catching websites. Can't wait to see how you all creatively use this. From here, we're going to start talking about how we can make our designs responsive, sort of how we can start using these CSS rules to make websites that look good for any type of device. So I will catch you all in that next video.